The ring wasn't hers to choose. The name wasn't one she'd grown up dreaming of. And the house, solid, handsome, entirely wrong, stood at the end of Crestfield Lane, like a sentence she hadn't written but was required to finish. Vera Sutton had agreed to the marriage in October, on a Tuesday, between the second and third cups of tea her mother had poured without asking. It hadn't been a conversation so much as an announcement dressed in the clothes of one. Her father had said Harlan Beckett was a good man. Her mother had said the Becketts had a respectable name. Her younger sister Delia had said nothing, which was the loudest thing in the room. Vera had said yes because the word no had no place to land. She was 24. She had a small competence in watercolors, a reasonable command of French, and a clear understanding that her family's circumstances had narrowed to the width of a door that a man named Harlan Beckett was willing to open. So she said yes, and she drank the third cup of tea, and she did not look at Delia, who had been the one Harlan Beckett first called on, back in August, before Delia had made it quietly, firmly known that she would not have him. No one spoke of that. It wasn't the kind of thing the Suttons spoke of. The wedding was in December, small, cold, correct. Vera wore her mother's altered dress and carried white flowers she couldn't name. Harlan Beckett stood at the altar with the expression of a man fulfilling a sensible obligation, and she supposed she wore much the same. The minister read the words. They both said what was required. Afterward, at the small reception in the Sutton parlor, her father shook Harlan's hand for a long time, and her mother cried in the way mothers cried at weddings, and Delia kissed Vera's cheek and whispered, "You didn't have to," and Vera said, "Yes I did," and that was the end of it. She moved into the house on Crestfield Lane on a gray Thursday in January. Harlan Beckett was not a cruel man. She had braced herself, privately, for cruelty, some version of it, some small cold current beneath the politeness. She had heard enough from women in her mother's circle to know that a man could be perfectly respectable in public and something else entirely at home. She had watched for it. She had paid attention. What she found instead was distance. He was courteous. He learned quickly how she took her coffee, and made sure it was available that way every morning without being asked. He held doors. He said please and thank you with the consistency of a man who had been well raised. When she came down with a winter cold in February, he appeared in the doorway of her room with a tray and a look of such earnest concern that she'd felt something she couldn't name shift somewhere behind her sternum. He just did not speak to her. Not really. He worked. He had a law practice in town, and he left early and returned in the evenings, and at dinner they discussed the weather, the news, the garden's prospects come spring. He asked how her day had been and listened to the answer with every appearance of attention. He never dismissed what she said. He never spoke over her. He was simply not there, even when he was. Vera had expected that, she supposed. She had not expected the particular quality of the absence. The way it had a texture, almost a specific weight she could feel in rooms he'd just left. She had not expected to notice him as much as she did. The way he rubbed the side of his jaw when he was thinking. The way he set his book down when she came in, even when she hadn't asked him to. The single time she'd heard him laugh. A real laugh. Surprised out of him by something his younger brother Theo said at Sunday dinner, and the way the sound had caught her completely off guard, like a light turned on in a room she'd assumed was empty. She did not let herself think too carefully about these observations. She wrote long letters to her friend Mabel instead, letters full of useful details and deliberate omissions, and she took up an ambitious kitchen garden project, and she read her way through Harlan's library shelf by shelf, and she told herself she was content. She was almost convincing. The trouble with Delia arrived in March. It came in the form of a letter first. Delia's handwriting, which slanted left in a way their mother had never managed to correct, on good paper that Vera didn't recognize. The letter said that Delia was well, that their parents were well, that the spring had come early to their part of town. It said these things for a page and a half, and then it said, "I have been seeing someone. I don't think mother and father know yet. I'm not certain what to do." Vera read the letter twice. Then she read between it the way you learned to read Delia, in the spaces between the careful words. She wrote back asking to visit. She took the train on a Saturday, while Harlan was at his office. She left a note, which felt like a strange small performance, the act of leaving a note for a husband she didn't quite know how to speak to. And she arrived at her parents' house at 10:30 to find her mother in a state that was not quite distress, and not quite excitement, but something tightly coiled between them. Delia was in the back parlor, with a young man named Will Forsyth, who worked in the counting house of a shipping firm, and had shoulders like a draft horse, and a way of looking at Delia that made Vera's chest do something complicated. The problem, as their mother laid it out to Vera over tea in the kitchen, was that Will Forsyth had no family of consequence, no real money, and had, in a moment of extremely poor judgment, called on Delia 3 times in a single week in a way the neighbors had certainly noticed. The problem, further, was that Delia had encouraged this. Had in fact done more than encourage it, though their mother did not say this precisely. Their mother said, "You know how Delia can be." Their mother said, "Your father is beside himself." Their mother said, after a pause in which Vera watched her measure each word, "People are talking." Vera looked at her hands around the teacup. She thought about August, when Harlan Beckett had first come to call, and Delia had said no with such quiet certainty. She thought about October, and the 3rd cup of tea. She thought about December and the white flowers she couldn't name, and Delia's whisper, "You didn't have to." "What do you need from me?" she said. Her mother's hands relaxed around her own cup. That was the answer, right there, in that small release of grip. Her mother had already decided what she needed. The question was only whether Vera would figure it out quickly enough. "A word with Delia," her mother said. "She'll listen to you." Delia, as it turned out, would not listen. Not to the reasonable parts, anyway. She sat in the back parlor after Will Forsyth had taken his leave. With excellent manners, Vera noticed, polite and easy, and not a bit abashed. And she looked at her older sister with the expression of someone who has already made up her mind and is waiting patiently for everyone else to finish speaking. "I know what you're going to say," Delia said. "Do you? That it's impractical, that the family needs something, that Will doesn't have the kind of position that would settle things." "That's roughly accurate," Vera said. "Is it wrong?" Delia looked out the window for a moment. She was 22, 2 years younger than Vera, and she had always been the prettier of the two. Not by much, and Vera had long since stopped minding, but there was something in the way Delia moved through rooms that collected attention without effort. Will Forsyth had certainly noticed. "I know it's not practical," Delia said. "But Vera, he looks at me like I matter." The words went somewhere quiet in Vera's chest and stayed there. "That's not nothing," Vera said. It came out before she could decide whether to say it. Delia looked at her then, looked at her properly. "How is it?" Delia said. "Truly." Vera thought about the house on Crestfield Lane, the coffee prepared exactly right every morning, the way Harlan held doors and said please and thank you and put down his book when she came in, the silence at dinner that was not unkind, the single surprised laugh. "It's fine," she said. Delia's face did something. "That's not what I asked. It's what I have to say," Vera said. And then before Delia could follow that thread somewhere, Vera wasn't ready to go. Will they receive Will Forsyth if he calls properly? Is that the issue, or has something happened that father is specifically opposed to the man? Delia hesitated. Something shifted behind her eyes. "He called on me at the Hargrove party," she said, "and we walked in the garden, without a chaperone, for about 20 minutes. Vera absorbed this. "Mrs. Hargrove saw," Delia added. "Of course, she did," Vera said. "Mrs. Hargrove sees everything and speaks of it immediately." "I know, so it's already moved past the stage where it can be quietly managed." "Yes." Vera set down her teacup. She looked at her sister, who was looking back at her with an expression that was half defiant and half something younger, something that wanted to be told it would be all right. "Does Will Forsyth want to marry you?" Vera said. "He hasn't asked. But yes. I think yes. Then he needs to ask. Properly. Soon. Before this becomes a story that gets told without him in it. Father won't receive him. Father will receive him if someone smooths the path first." Vera paused. "Let me talk to Harlan." She hadn't known she was going to say that until she said it. On the train home she sat with her hands folded and thought about what exactly she had committed to. She had committed to asking Harlan Beckett, her husband of 3 months, with whom she discussed the weather and the garden and little else, to vouch for or otherwise assist in legitimizing the courtship of a young man with no family connections, on behalf of the sister who had refused to marry Harlan in the first place. She thought about this for the better part of an hour. Then she thought about Will Forsyth's face when he looked at Delia, the particular quality of it, like she was the only legible thing in the room. She thought about Delia saying, "He looks at me like I matter." She stared out the train window at the fields going gray in the early evening, and didn't let herself follow that line of thought all the way to its end. She told Harlan that evening. Not all of it. She wasn't sure she could tell all of it clearly, and she wasn't sure what parts were hers to tell. But the practical shape of it, Delia, Will Forsyth, the garden at the Hargrove party, Mrs. Hargrove's reliable observational habits, her father's likely refusal. She told him carefully, seated across the dinner table with the lamp lit between them, and she watched his face. He listened. He did what she'd noticed he did when he was actually attending to something. Set very still, the small habitual gestures stopped, eyes fixed on a point slightly to the left of her face, which she'd learned meant he was thinking rather than looking. When she finished, he said, "Your sister, who turned down my initial inquiry in August." There it was. She had wondered when it would surface. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could not read the quiet. "And you want me to, what? Precisely." "I think if you spoke to my father he would receive Will Forsyth. He respects your judgment. And if you were willing to indicate that Forsyth is a man worth consideration." "Do I know Forsyth?" "No, but I could make inquiries. Or you could meet him." Harlan looked at her then. Actually looked at her, the kind of looking she was not entirely accustomed to from him, direct and considering. "Why does this matter to you?" he said. The question was not unkind. It was genuinely curious. "Because she loves him," Vera said. "And I don't think she should have to choose the practical thing if she doesn't have to." She heard it the moment she said it. The particular edge of it, the shape of what she had not quite said. Harlan was quiet. "No," he said finally, carefully. "I don't suppose she should." The meeting between Harlan and Will Forsyth happened on a Wednesday at Harlan's office, which Vera thought was a more neutral and therefore more useful location than anywhere domestic. She had not asked to be there. She had engineered the thing and then very deliberately removed herself from it. Harlan came home that evening and said, over dinner, that Forsyth seemed a steady, young man with a reasonable head and what appeared to be genuine intentions. "He was nervous," Harlan said, which sounded like approval. "He was meeting my husband," Vera said, and then caught herself slightly on the word, on the ordinary naturalness of it, and kept her eyes on her plate. "He spoke well of your sister," Harlan said. "Clearly. Without embellishment. She inspires that," Vera said. "Clarity." Harlan made a small sound that might have been agreement. He picked up his fork. Then he set it down. "Vera." She looked up. "When I first called on the Suttons," he said, I want to be clear that I understood at the time that it was not, that your sister's decision was." He stopped. Started again. "I am not in the habit of pretending I don't know the shape of things. I knew when we married what the arrangement was." The lamp held very still between them. "So did I," she said. "I want you to know," he said, "that I have not, that my regard for you is not." Another stop. She watched him finding words with more difficulty than she would have expected of a man who argued in courtrooms for a living. "It is not less than it would have been if the circumstance had been different." She looked at him. "That is a very careful sentence," she said. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more like relief at being seen. "I am a careful man," he said. "I've noticed," she said. And then, because she was her mother's daughter, and had learned to navigate carefully as well, "I find I don't mind it as much as I expected." Her father received Will Forsyth 2 weeks later. Harlan had made a quiet call beforehand. She'd found out from Delia, not from Harlan himself, and said a few words about Forsyth's character and prospects that had apparently been exactly sufficient. Will asked her father formally. Her father said yes. Delia's letter arrived on a Thursday morning and Vera read it at the kitchen table, with her coffee exactly as she took it, which Harlan had already ensured before he left for the office. And she felt something expand in her chest that she hadn't known was compressed. She was glad. She was genuinely glad, in a way that was clean and uncomplicated, and she let herself feel it. When Harlan came home that evening she was in the garden, which had started to come into its own now that she'd had 3 months to work on it. She heard him come around the side of the house. He did that sometimes, instead of going through, and she looked up. "Delia wrote," she said. Will asked. "I know," he said. "Forsyth stopped by the office this morning." A pause. "He wanted to express his thanks. He didn't have to do that." "No," Harlan said. "He didn't. He came and stood beside her at the edge of the garden bed, looking at the things she'd planted. He didn't ask what any of them were. He just stood there, which she found she didn't mind. She found actually that she was glad he was there. "You could have told me," she said, "about the call to my father. I wasn't sure you'd want to know the details." "I would have," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll remember that," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the garden with an expression she couldn't fully read. She was getting better at reading him, but it was slow work, like learning a language in a country where everyone is too polite to correct your errors. But there was something in it, in the way he stood there, that felt different from the January evenings and the February silences. Something that had shifted without announcement and was now simply present. "Harlan," she said. He looked at her. "Why did you agree to help them?" "You didn't have to. It wasn't. There was no obligation." He seemed to consider this honestly. He looked back at the garden. "Because you asked me," he said. And because you asked me for the right reasons. She thought about that. That's all? No, he said. Not entirely. He didn't offer the rest of it, she didn't push. She was learning his particular architecture, the way he came to things sideways, the way directness had to be earned, and she found she had more patience for it than she might have predicted in December. They stood in the garden in the evening light for a while longer, not talking, and it was the most comfortable silence she'd sat inside in a long time. The Delia and Will matter resolved itself quietly, which was the best way things could resolve. There was an engagement announced in April, small and decent, and the neighbors adjusted their opinions accordingly, and Mrs. Hargrove was observed to say that Will Forsyth was a fine young man, which she had not been saying in March. Vera's mother came to tea on a Tuesday and said, in the kitchen while Vera made the pot, that she supposed it had all worked out, hadn't it? She said this in the particular tone that meant, I know you had something to do with this, and I am choosing not to specify what, because specifying it would require acknowledging too many things at once. Vera poured the tea and agreed that it had worked out, and her mother patted her hand and said nothing further about it. Before she left, her mother looked around the kitchen, at the garden coming through the window, at the orderly shelves, at the general evidence of a house that was being lived in, rather than endured, and she said, Are you happy, Vera? Vera thought about the question. I think I might be getting there, she said. Her mother looked at her for a moment. Her expression was hard to read. Vera had spent 24 years reading it, and still sometimes missed things. But there was something soft in it. That's more than some people manage, her mother said. Harlan started coming to the garden in the evenings. Not every evening, and never announced. He would simply appear at the side of the house with his jacket off and ask if she needed anything moved or turned or carried. She always found something, not because she particularly needed the help, but because she found she liked having him there. He asked about the plants eventually, she told him. He listened in the way she'd learned to recognize as actual listening, and the next week he came home with a book about kitchen gardens he'd found in a shop on Greer Street, which he left on the kitchen table without comment. She read it. She left it on his reading chair the next morning with a note that said 3 things in here are wrong, I've marked them. He came home that evening with a different expression than usual, lighter, something almost playful in it, and said, Only 3? Only 3 so far, she said. He smiled. A real one, not the polite version she'd gotten in December, not the professional one she'd seen him use at Sunday dinner. Something that reached his eyes and stayed there for a moment. She felt it in her chest, the same way she'd felt his surprised laugh back in February. A light turned on in a room. I'll look for more, he said. Please do, she said. In May she wrote to Mabel and said, I think this marriage might be becoming something I didn't expect. I'm not entirely sure what to do with that. I am not complaining, Mabel wrote back. Vera, that is the best letter you have sent me in 2 years. Do not do anything with it. Just let it be. She folded the letter and kept it in her desk drawer. On a Saturday morning near the end of May, when the garden was past the uncertain stage and beginning to look like itself, Harlan came down to breakfast before she expected him and found her at the table with her coffee and the wrong book. She had reached the end of the gardening shelf and moved on, without quite deciding to his personal reading, a history of American land law that she was finding genuinely absorbing. She looked up when he came in. He stopped at the door for a moment, looking at the book. That's, he said. I know. I ran out of things I'd meant to read. She held it up. The chapter on the Land Ordinance of 1785 is quite good. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that appeared when she surprised him. And then he came and sat down across from her and said, What do you think of the argument in Chapter 4? She had opinions about Chapter 4. They talked for an hour. The coffee went cold, and neither of them noticed. When it finally ran down, when the conversation had gone where conversations eventually go, back to the present moment, Harlan was looking at her with that expression that she was still learning to read, the one with more in it than he typically let into his face. I owe you something, he said. She waited. I married you, he said, because it was a sensible arrangement and I needed. I had reasons that were practical, and I had told myself that practical was sufficient. He started again with the same difficulty she'd seen in him that evening over dinner when he'd tried to explain the shape of what they were. I underestimated. I did not account for the possibility that it would become. Harlan, she said. He looked at her. You don't have to account for everything before you say it, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I find I would like to know you better. It was a modest sentence. It was a very careful sentence. She understood that for him it was also an enormous one. I think, she said, that's already happening. He looked at her. That expression, still learning it, still finding its edges, was there again, and she decided that she could sit with not knowing exactly what it meant. She had time to learn it. She had, it turned out, considerable time. Yes, he said. I suppose it is. Outside, the garden was doing what it had been doing all spring, without acknowledgement or announcement, growing into something that had started in uncertain soil, and now, without quite being noticed, had taken root.